Welcome back to Strange Exiles and to the first of an ongoing series of special episodes, collaborations with Revol Press. As many of you know, I'm an editor at Revol, and they published my book, The Darkest Timeline, in 2024. Since then, I've been working with Mike Watson to find and develop new writers for the press, and we have some very exciting titles coming up in 2026 and beyond. Over the coming months, I'll be interviewing existing and upcoming Revol authors in these very special bonus episodes of Strange Exiles, starting with today's guest, Gareth Stuart Farmer. His forthcoming book for Revol is called Writing Autism, the Anti-Biography of a Liminal Resident, and it's due in 2026, early 27. We're just confirming the release schedule for that. Gareth is a writer, poet, and academic whose work focuses on the lived experience of autism with a mercurial approach that puts the reader into the neurodivergent experience in direct, unique, and sometimes challenging ways. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to see you, mate. We actually met in person before. We went down to London for a Revol reading event, and had a very nice evening sort of reading poems and prose in Twickenham. So very much enjoyed meeting you there. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, it was great. It was great to hear your work for the first time live. I was really impressed, and the event was wonderful. Actually, it was a very welcoming and interesting event. So really,
Yeah, we had good fun. It was like right by Eel Pie Island, which I believe was a little bit of a spot for Rolling Stones and other kind of hippie bands back in the 60s. I saw Eel Pie Island actually referenced on an old episode of Absolutely Fabulous the other day.
Right.
And gave me a little bit of a chuckle.
Yeah, it's a really unique place, isn't it? It's a very
Yeah.
strange. It's like a little pocket out, like it's a pocket in London, that has a very unique vibe to it. So it was very interesting to be there.
It was a weird mix of sort of conservative cricket club types and then very, very esoteric hippie dudes.
Yeah, that's exactly what it
ladies.
is. Yeah, the conservative cricket types. I was slightly perturbed by their presence, but actually they seemed to get into it eventually.
They did. I think they enjoyed both of our work, so that was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll be talking about some of your work today. You can see a lot of Gareth's work at his website, which is garethstuartfarmer.com. And there's examples there of Gareth's poetry, some of his academic research and publications. He's also a woodworker. We were just discussing the beautiful bookshelves you can see in the background there, which are made by his own fair hand. So fair to call you a man of many talents, Gareth.
Well, I mean, yeah, sort of. I mean, woodworking was something that I sort of got into when I moved into this little cottage about 5 years ago, and it's become something of an obsession. Primarily as it's totally non-verbal, which I enjoy. And my book Kerf, which came out in 2022 with 87 Press. I don't know if you know, but the kerf is the cut, the wood that comes out of wood when you cut it in half. And so I use that as a sort of, so if you measure like a 1 foot thingy and you cut it in half, it's not going to be 1 foot. It's going to have the sawdust taken out. So that's kerf. And I use that as a sort of metaphor to talk about sort of the discarded aspects of society and an analogy with neurodivergence, but also thinking about labor, silent labor, and how labor's constructed into woodwork, but is kind of silent. Anyway, so yes, I very much enjoy woodworking. So it's a thing, it's an obsession.
That's great. It's really interesting. That's something I'm going to ask you about, is like how these different activities sort of feed into one another. Somebody who writes kind of critical essays, poetry, and one or two other things, I definitely find that they sort of bleed into each other in quite a pleasing way sometimes.
Yeah, they have to. I mean, it's a sort of an integrated process, perhaps unwittingly integrated. And you find, particularly when you get to our age, you find that you've pretty much been doing the same stuff like throughout your life, even in the different activities. So music, woodwork, fiction, poetry, they sort of it's all interconnected.
We all have themes, I think, for sure.
And then you can't get away from them. They are indomitable.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit, first of all, let's kick off by exploring a little bit about your background. Can you tell me, how long have you been writing about autism, and kind of where did that journey start for you?
Writing about autism only around 5 years, and that's because I was diagnosed with what's called ASD, or autistic spectrum disorder. In old money, in the old DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I would be Asperger's, or that's what they call it. But Asperger as a person and as a term has gone out of fashion because of his connection with sort of euthanasia, not euthanasia, eugenics.
Eugenics, yeah.
And so he, no, people rarely say Asperger's anymore. Although there's a funny joke that someone says you've got the Asperger's, which I find quite amusing. But but anyway, so ASD. Here before that time, I had just been writing. But what was interesting is that, and I didn't really anticipate to be actually writing about, or at least exploring autism in writing. But apropos of what we just talked about, what I realized is that actually I've probably been writing about autism without realizing it since I started writing, because I'm very interested in, or have been very confused by, particularly communication, power dynamics in language, miscommunication. And also a lot of the writers that I have encountered and enjoy, without wishing to sort of what they call head canon, which means to make someone autistic in the past. But a lot of them, I think, were autistic. And but explicitly, I've been writing about autism since around about 2021. But before I did so, I wanted to do a lot of reading about autism in literature, autism psychology, autism sociology, etc., before I started writing about it. So Kerf was my first sort of minor book, explicitly thinking about autism. And then academically, I've been writing about autism again very recently, and I'm developing a project which perhaps we can talk about later, on autism. So it hasn't been that long, and it's an exploration really about in my work. I also, one of the reasons I was loath to write about autism, in particular my autistic experience, is because, again, hitherto, because I have been, or considered myself, a sort of neo-modernist writer, and a formalist, and an impersonal writer. I really didn't want to write about myself, which is why my book, that we'll probably come on to, is written in the second person, because I'm sort of edging my way towards writing about, I'm loath to use the I. So anyway, so writing about autism for a while, but I'm still sort of feeling my way into a comfort with, let's say, writing explicitly about it.
That's really interesting. I'm going to definitely ask you about the kind of second person approach in your work. I mean, particularly when I saw you read from your work in Twickenham, that sort of came alive for me. It was almost like the penny dropped, having read a bit of the manuscript, and I found a way into it by seeing you read it, which was really interesting. But you're also an academic and a lecturer. So prior to writing about autism, what's your field of study, and where do you teach?
Well, so I teach at the University of Bedfordshire. I teach English literature, and also I teach linguistics now as well. And I've taught there since 2011 in a really good sort of education department. But I teach literature and linguistics. And my PhD, I mean, I've always worked on poetry and poetics, so poetry and the theory of poetry, and theoretical frameworks around poetry, particularly informed by a lot of modernist scholarship. And this, when I say neo-modernist, I mean the sort of modernist spirit in contemporary works, rather than sort of, so and so I've always been interested in that. So my PhD was on the poet Veronica Forrest Thompson, who's also a big, and this is my cat Veronica, by the way, who's
the cat is named after the poet.
After
That's
Veronica
beautiful.
Forrest Thompson, yes. So she I thought she might join us, actually. So my PhD was on her work, and I've become the executor of the estate of her work as well. So for those who don't know, she died in 1975 at the age of 27, but she wrote some really interesting and very unique and unusual poetry, but also very unique and unusual critical literary theory. So I've always written about poetry, and so since then I've written a number of it primarily sort of theoretical works or theoretical essays on poetry and poetics, and aesthetics, as they relate to it, but sort of bonkers mad aesthetics, and strange poetry, and poetry that's very recondite and rebarbative, and on difficulty and why people write difficult work. But primarily I think that over the last few years I've been writing about style and about the formations of literary styles, in particular I've always been informed by Raymond Williams's work about what he calls the structures of feelings and how feelings develop. And I've been thinking about how literary styles emerge, in against material conditions. So yeah, it's primarily poetry, but and experimental writing that I write about, and that's what I'm doing. So, but then again, very recently, I've written an essay on, two recent essays. One of which was on autism in academia, in particular thinking about autistic staff in academia. But another more literary essay I wrote was about literature and poetry in the welfare state, and in a really interesting collection of essays. And what I was thinking about is that the poets that I particularly enjoy critically reject the idea of the notion of a welfare state, which might sound contradictory, but the idea that you are a subject dependent on a state. So it's a difficult argument, really, because it's sort of that argument where you say, I don't believe in charity, and people say, well, yeah, but what about, we need charity, and you say, no, but it's the state should be looking after people or not, and So anyway, so I was writing about subjects and dependency on states, and particularly how I can map that into linguistic practices that kind of try and destabilize the sort of status quo of singularized, individualized identity. So yeah, those are the types of things I've been writing about recently, as well as autism.
That's really interesting. It connects to a later question I've got about kind of the work of Mark Fisher and what he wrote about how mental health connects to, both the teaching profession, but also, society at large. So we'll go back to that. I mean, when we met in Twickenham, you read some text from your book, as I was saying. I found the prose itself to be quite poetic. I mean, it's fair to say that this is a book that's quite formally experimental in terms of how it approaches languages. So yeah, what's behind the approach to the way you use language in the book compared to, say, how you used it in your book of poems for Broken Sleep?
Well, believe it or not, my book, Writing Autism, which was originally called 8 Essays on Autism, until someone pointed out that that's a terrible title for an essay, for a book, because no one wants to read books on essays. But by the way, about titles, my last book with Broken Sleep, which is called What's That Instead of Ego 2, Acrostic Aftermaths and Other Poems, is also a terrible title if you want to try and sell things, because people are like, what the fuck is that about? And it's a good question, frankly. But yeah, so believe it or not, this Writing Autism, which we're now calling Writing Autism, and hopefully that will continue to be the title, but we'll see. It was supposed to be me writing straight, that is to say, writing without the sort of dialectical, critical voice. But what I realized is that, and so it was supposed to be prose written straight. But what I realized is that I was finding it very hard, for reasons I just outlined earlier, to write in a sort of transparently straightforward way. That is to say, using language which seemed to me to be quite normative. So my poetry, if anyone's read my poetry, for example, in What's That Instead of Ego 2, there's a reason for the title, but I won't go into it. But the acrostic aftermaths, the acrostic aftermaths are acrostics about terms relating to autism. So the acrostics go down, and for example, I've got autistic fatigue, and then I write a poem in that, and it's very deliberately quite resisted language, which sort of resists normative meaning. to some people it might be frustrating, but what I'm trying, so when it came to writing autism, I was trying to write it straight, but what I realized is that I'd read, as part of my research, well, not really research, just reading about other people's experiences. I've read lots and lots of memoirs, all of which are very, very good and very interesting. And particularly now, there's a real booming market of, particularly like celebs, being diagnosed ADHD or autistic, and they're writing these books. And I've enjoyed reading them, but what I don't enjoy about them is that, as I say, they sort of write about their strange struggles in being autistic or neurodivergent, but in like what I call normative garb, like a style that is normative. So writing autism is very much me trying to write about the experiences of autism, but using a language which alienates my normative practices, like alienates normative linguistic practices, because it seems to me that if you're trying to get to describing the weirdnesses and strangenesses and struggle and scrap that often goes on in an autistic life, you don't want to write in a sort of peaceful mode, in sentences that don't illustrate the process of the struggle. So writing autism is my attempt to come up with a style that sort of inflects, that tries to reflect, or mimetically, perhaps stylistically, mimetically, the sort of agonistic struggle of using language to communicate as an autistic person in a society and culture where language is often not critically evaluated. So it's a very difficult question, and so therefore that's why the "you" is used. I don't know if you wanted to ask about that, but I'm very interested in the work, if not the man, the madman, Louis Althusser, who talks about the notion of interpellation, which, for those who don't know, is this idea that you are kind of hailed through language and become a subject in language. And I like the "you" because when someone's reading the book, or when I'm reading the book, I'm saying sort of like, you did that, you did that, you did that. And so it's about me, but it's also pushing out the subjectivity to the reader or to the audience to sort of show them how an autistic person might feel interpellated as a subject in language. So it's a sort of an estrangement of those processes. The problem is it's a risk, because the risks of my style and others' style is that you actually end up alienating a reader. And so that's why I tried to sort of leaven a lot of my work with wit. But it is, to go back to your point about poetry, it is poetic in the sense that, I mean, I say poetic in inverted commas, in the sense that it's playful. And it's very alliterative. It's very sort of, and so I won't write, and that's where the sort of perhaps the influence of Joyce comes in the sense that James Joyce wanted to use language in a way that estranges it while using it. Joyce's idea was to try to get to the more specifics of life, to sort of represent life. And I suppose what I'm doing is trying to find a language which more specifically describes the autistic experience, even though it's a sort of failure in many ways, because of course it's never fully going to describe it. But it's I suppose it's a register on the linguistic level that if you're going to write about the estranging experiences of autism and perhaps neurodivergence, then to use a language like other memoirs that is sort of palatable and feeding into a culture industry, to sort of refer to Adorno, then you're not really, all you're doing is you're describing an experience, and then people can put it away and think, oh, people experience it that way. You're not really, the language is not really challenging the reader.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that both Mike and I liked about this text. Reading the early draft, it's inaccessible in a way that is alienating at first, but then particularly because of that second person register begins to pull you in. And I think, given that we're trying to publish books, a lot of which we're kind of going for like a vein of critical theory that's accessible and easy for the reader to get into, rather than being like very dense and academic. This book is kind of pushing in the opposite direction, but it's doing it with a specific intent. And I think that the second person serves it really well in terms of giving you a window into a subjective experience by making it personal. And I think particularly hearing it read aloud, that really came to the fore for me. The book title also kind of mentions liminality. So what aspects of the sort of liminal experience or aesthetic were you setting out to explore? Like, how, in what sense is the book about liminality or the liminal?
Well, in a very straightforward way, in a very simple way, it's trying to articulate this notion of feeling, well, to use the title of your sort of strangely exilic all the time. And this is a very common neurodivergent experience, is that sense of confusion about being on the outside of things. Or one of the common thing, particularly for people with what we call nowadays low support needs autism, which is a bit of a misnomer, because in many ways people like me actually require support, but it's not really clear that I do. Anyway, my point, or what used to be called high functioning autism, is that you seem to be getting on. You know, I have a job, which is, you know, I'm unusual in terms of autistic people. I'm a minority in terms of autistic people that are able to maintain a full-time job. And that's not criticism. That's because the stresses are so much. And yet, but in the interrelationships between me and my colleagues in university, and this is again not a criticism, but it's and just my general life, is it's a constant feeling of liminality, of being in between, being not quite getting it, and that leads to a lot of communication issues. So the anti-biography of a liminal resident is a bit of a joke, because in a sense that it you know, because my book was called a memoir. I didn't really want it to be an autobiography, because it's kind of a biography, but an autobiography, but not quite. You know, I talk about my childhood, in particular my development of language. But what I was trying to describe, that sort of sense of liminality, is to use a term that Julia Kristeva used, that sense of being abject, that sort of, that you're sort of, you feel, I as an autistic person feel very abject, that is to say, sort of outside, and objectivity has a lot of toxicity attached to it, in the sense that you'd never feel that you're quite engaging, you never feel you're quite able to do the things. Even though you are able to do things, you're not able to sort of fully embody something or fully get into things. So the liminality, for me anyway, it's that sense of being in between. And I think liminality also relates to, and in my book I write about Homi Bhabha's and post-colonial criticism. And it's not necessarily reckless use of it, but what I'm saying is that sense of being an in-between character as a colonial subject, for example, that you are let's say, put it in an autistic sense, you're kind of colonized by a normative society, and you look, or you might look like, perhaps, or you might try and get along in that society, but you always feel slightly on the outside, and you always feel sort of a kind of hybrid. And it's the struggle between, let's say, put it in an autistic sense, it's the struggle between a constant feeling that I'm going to have a meltdown, and then trying to maintain a kind of professional seeming calm persona. And the bridge between a sort of meltdown and function is the mask. So the masking, and so the masking enables the liminality to not seem as extreme to other people, but it requires a lot of energy to sort of bridge that gap. So I mean, you know, it's not a particularly well theorized idea, but liminality is quite important as a sort of an experiential aspect, which is something that is a daily thing, you know.
That's interesting. So you're kind of connecting it to sort of ideas like the subaltern
Yeah, yeah.
figure that Spivak describes. Yeah, that's a really interesting approach. I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk about some of these barriers and challenges, particularly in the context of, many people who are autistic or diagnosed with neurodivergence, like you say, they're not able to work. They're kind of forcibly outside society. They don't have necessarily a choice over that.
Yeah.
What in terms of these barriers, what do you think that neurotypical people could do more of to help autistic people navigate these challenges, either in the world of work, if they encounter somebody who is autistic or neurodivergent, or in society generally? Like, how do we address some of those barriers, if that's not too huge a question?
Well, I mean, it is a large question, but it's a good question to ask. I mean, I write about this in an essay on autism and academia. I mean, and the first thing to say is that many people agree that the first thing to say is that we all live within sort of capital relations, and we don't necessarily need to get into that. And of course, capital relations have their own odious sort of expectations. And so in many ways, capital relations are iniquitous to the ability for anyone to function properly without the sort of notions of progress and success and individualized notions. Nevertheless, and so there's a great book. There are great books, Empire of Normality, by I can't remember his name, but he writes about I can't remember his name. Chapman, by Nick Chapman. Robert Chapman, sorry, and Empire of Normality, Neurodiversity and Capitalism with Pluto. It's a really good book, and he talks about how neurodivergence is kind of made worse in kind of capitalist systems. But one of the things that most people agree is that if you made, let's say, the workplace more tolerable for autistic and neurodivergent people, it would be more tolerable for everyone. So that's the first thing. But the thing that a lot of neurodivergent people find exhausting is that you're constantly having to explain to people why you can't do certain things, and then the sort of like and what institutions have, they have diversity policies, which mean that they say, oh, okay, well, we'll give you accommodations. But the problem is with accommodations is that they're only sustainable by yourself. And so the things that would be much easier is just if there was an expectation by default, de facto expectation, that a number of your workforce will be neurodivergent, and therefore there will be automatic frameworks in place to accommodate for neurodivergence, and whatever that means. I think the lens by which, I think one of the things that is difficult with autism and ADHD is that they're sort of inscrutable. Whereas if you think about dyslexia, and I'm also dyslexic, there's often a comorbidity between, I hate that phrase, but comorbidity between neurodivergent. But dyslexia, you sort of say, okay, I'm dyslexic, I find it difficult to read, therefore, my company will give me yellow paper or something like that. That's a very good thing to do, an obvious thing to do. Or they'll give me a little bit more time to construct the paper that I need to do or what have you. But with autism, because there's so many varieties in autism and neurodivergence, it is difficult to find accommodations. But I think the most important thing would be for all institutions to, as I say, assume that you have a number of your staff that are either diagnosed or undiagnosed neurodivergent, and there to be automatic conditions for everyone, that sense of diversity will be part of the expectations of your how you work. And I don't but the problem, and that's why oftentimes it's iniquitous with capital relations, because capital relations assumes a homogeneity about, for example, notions of productivity, or if let's say if Gareth can write a lecture, then why does he find it unbearable to have plans changed? Or if Gareth is a very good teacher, or can really interact with people, why does he find it really hard to sit in meetings? That type of thing. And so what tends to happen is, particularly if you're again in high functioning, is that you end up becoming your own apologist. So I mean, there's a running joke in my family that, you know, since I could speak, I've apologized about myself. So I suppose, to put it in another way, if all people were encouraged that they didn't have to necessarily apologize for their behavior because they felt they were letting the institution down, then that would be a lot easier, because it would also mean that we wouldn't also always have to explain why we need things. So the transformations that can happen within institutions is to de-individualize the necessity for particular people to say, I need this, and to create a system, which perhaps seems impossible nowadays, which is a much more dynamic environment where every single individual can be encouraged to flourish without the expectations that you're kind of all streamlined into a very homogenized, let's say, notion of productivity, which of course is exhausting for everyone, but it's more exhausting in many ways, in some ways, for neurodivergent people.
That's fascinating. I mean, the discourse around disability is all about barriers and removing barriers. It's about making the world more accessible. I read the book Neuroqueer Heresies.
It's a great book
by Nick Walker. Yeah, and that was a game changer for me. I think it helped me understand a little bit more about, first of all, the breadth and scope of the neurodiverse experience, but also, the subtitle of that book, he talks about autistic empowerment, and he's very much describing something similar to what you're saying, which is about that it's less about accommodations and more about providing the circumstances whereby everybody can flourish. So that's really fascinating that you kind of unpack it in that specific way. It's a difficult one for most people, I think, to understand the difference between autism as something that's part of your identity, being autistic, being neurodiverse, versus the challenges around mental health, which, obviously come along with that, as you've been describing, but are also distinct from it in certain ways. I mean, and similarly, I mean, in the work of Mark Fisher, capitalism and mental health are very directly linked. And it's also something other left-wing writers have explored, and it's definitely something Revol are keen to explore as a small press. I think we're actively looking for books which are, written by people who have experience of navigating other mental health conditions as well. How do you think that this engagement with themes of mental health can help us to work towards a fairer or more inclusive world? Do you think the kind of writing that you do and that we're trying to publish can do some of the heavy lifting with this?
Well, I mean, obviously you hope so. I mean, I think from my perspective, I mean, and this is a very common experience, particularly for late diagnosed autistic people and ADHD people, is that you have a history, of profound sort of mental health difficulties, and my case is sort of slightly classic in that, I had multiple breakdowns and found a lot of things very difficult, was diagnosed with sort of borderline personality disorder, and all this sort of stuff until until I got this autism diagnosis, which kind of makes a lot of sense to me. The problem is, of course, there's still a lot of weird ignorance about neurodivergence. But so let's just say most I would say that most autistic people, most perhaps people with ADHD have perhaps experienced quite a profound degree of mental health difficulties, and that's because of in many ways produced by the disablement of society and culture rather than being disabled. I mean, that's a useful term. That's a useful way of describing things to people, is that it's not necessarily that I'm disabled, it's that I'm disabled by society and culture. And of course, and so I think perhaps one of the things with autistic people in particular is the extremism by which they are disabled, on a sort of sliding scale. So everyone is disabled by the relations and the conditions in which we live, but the extremism or the versions of disablement in autistic people again are perhaps more extreme. I don't know if that's a particularly useful way of saying it, but I think it's a really good question about Revol Press and small presses, and particularly in relation to Mark Fisher's book, because of course Mark Fisher's book Capitalism is been incredibly popular, as we all know, and it's a bestseller and did really well. Was it Zero Books that did it?
It was, yeah.
And and so for those of us that are interested in sort of small press theory, small press poetry, we know the power of those types of books to enable a kind of, at least a cognition that things are awry, or the articulation that most people will recognize that things are awry, and that the relations in which we operate, the society and culture in which we operate, produce the conditions for mental health difficulties, and so therefore they are kind of prescribing or diagnosing these things, and those ideas fire people's imagination. The problem I see it, and it's a problem that perhaps writers always need to write about, and certainly the books that I've read about Revol Press do write about these, by Revol Press do write about this, is that first of all, there's sort of an attention span about people wanting to read this type of theory, and the sense in which, because the point about a lot of these books, and the point about my book, and I deliberately didn't do this, but I don't necessarily offer solutions. I offer diagnoses and a critical linguistic practice, which offers a sort of recondite alternative, but it doesn't say these are the solutions. So I think that the role of not only Revol Press is to keep on inviting conversations about these things, using great theory, interesting insights, using stylistic means by which to grab people's attention, but and to offer dialogue, and to show that if things are going to change, they require a critically informed, stylistically ingenious scrap that is necessary. So in other words, culture and theory, the Revol Press and other small presses, and poetry presses as well, a lot of the sort of dynamic, brilliant poets that are writing on small presses, offer the opportunity for sort of culture and theory to be a sort of vibrant challenge to the conditions in which we live. Now, whether people actually read them is another thing, or whether there's a huge appetite for this. But as your anecdote prior to us recording about someone that had read your book, and I mean, I think there is an appetite. It's just that, and I think there's an increasing appetite made for this type of sort of theory. But I think you're quite right about accessibility. And that's very important. I think one of the things that I've learned, and I think this probably happens when you get into middle age, is I used to be very, very sort of pure formalist, a kind of disingenuous elitist in the sense of my understanding of culture, in a very sort of like, the culture industry is awful, and everything should be obscure, and we should all be listening to kind of like really obscure jazz and what have you, even though I knew that I didn't even like that stuff. You know, so what I'm talking about is Theodore Adorno, and I was surrounded during my studies of, you know, hardcore Adornoites. That then dovetailed into sort of hardcore kind of Deleuze and Guattari, how you pronounce the name, like those sort of theories, which are very, very useful. But when I was writing my book and a lot of my poetry, it's developing, even though a lot of my poetry is quite difficult, actually, I try and leaven all my work with a sort of sense of humor and wit. Well, I mean, and that's arguable, but in the sense that what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to do the critical, obscure stuff, which is sort of like defamiliarizing language and estranging language, but also realizing that it's also important that, you know, we are embodied people in an interconnected society, and that the sort of aesthetic wafts of elitist modernists don't really touch that. And so I think it's important, I think, and you're right about Revol Press books, they're all written in a really interesting, engaging way, and all have these kind of beautiful sort of poetic moments which are engaging. And so it's not like dry theory that's only for the academics. It's engaging writing that introduces people to really interesting theory. And actually, I think that most people, if they gave it a little bit of time, would share in that sense of alienation that we all write about. So I think it's an ongoing process. I think with Revol is that, you know, we're trying to find interesting ways of describing theory and poetry and literature and culture as a way to, I don't know, try almost mitigate the difficulties that we all face. So I don't know if I've really answered your question, but I think that Revol Press has a very strong role, as do other small presses. And, you know, presses like Pluto, Verso, they're all still, they're churning out a lot of books. You know, and I've got so many Verso, Pluto books, all of the Revol Press books. And so, you know, there seems to be an appetite for it. But as I was talking to a friend the other day about poetry and stuff, he was saying, do people actually read anymore? And I was like, I don't know, you know, like maybe people just order the book. It's like, you know, we all order the LRB, but how many of us actually read the whole thing cover to cover every time it comes? I mean, I've got a massive pile of the London Review of books, and I was looking at them yesterday thinking, I've only read like one of these.
Yeah. I mean, I could say the same about Substack. Like, I subscribe to many more Substacks than I regularly read. And, you know, I guess we could even say the same about that event that we did in Twickenham. I think, you know, we were all sitting there, everybody was drinking sort of £8 halves of expensive fancy lager. And then when we introduced Revol Press and the idea of a left-wing small press, everybody clapped like, this is a great thing. We're glad that exists. But I don't think we sold that many books that night. No, even though the books were a tenner, you know. So.
Well, I mean, it reminds me. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I think it's either your book, The Darkest Timeline, or Adam Turl's book, which the title leads me to
Gothic Capitalism.
Gothic Capitalism. One of the things I realize that it disinhibits people, and I suppose you could talk about it in terms of autism, but also you could talk about it that one of the things that we are not allowed to talk about, it seems, in the last 15 years is class. And so if you take, for example, if you write, I mean, a great poet sorry, Veronica, a great poet that died sadly recently, called Sean Bonney, was brilliant sort of anarchist, theorist, poet, fantastic. And he wrote this great phrase that I've got tattooed on my arm, which is in the enemy language it is necessary to lie. In the enemy language is necessary to lie. And so this very critical understanding of linguistics. But he talked a lot about class. But the thing is, what I'm saying is that I think people have an appetite to know that class is important. But somehow in our culture and society, through the BBC, through the Guardian, through all these sort of organs, class is not something we're actually encouraged to think about. And I think that writing by Revol Press and others needs to say it's important that we think and read about this stuff. So in a way, Revol Press is like combating a kind of malaise about talking about class, which would sort of break through to getting people to kind of read more about it, as it were. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that sense in which there is an, as you say, we're, and also alluding to these contradictions, right? This notion that, you know, we're sitting there in a thoroughly middle class environment talking about class,
Yeah,
and we're consuming these ideas as consumers rather than as activists, and
yeah,
and so it's very easy to pocket these things off, you know, again, to contribute to the culture industry of talking about class but not doing anything about it. And I think Revol
yeah,
Press is in a very unique position to try and do that. But whether, you know, and we always have to have an optimism that people will buy books even if they don't read them,
yeah.
to encourage more. And good, because I think there is a massive appetite out there, but we're all disinhibited and we're all tired,
Mm,
because our attention is being elicited by marketing and algorithms and social media and stuff like that, and that's designed, you know.
yeah, yeah,
So I think that I'm all for the long form, you know, and to but then you end up sounding like some ossified dinosaur, like cultural, you know, oh, let's all sit around reading. And then it becomes a class thing again. It's because those who have access to time and money to consume these sort of things are also the people that don't have to work for, you know, 14 hours a day and you know,
yeah.
just to, you know, pay their exorbitant rent.
It's a fascinating thing. I mean, even in my experience with podcasting, you know, you're doing this forum, which is like a long form conversation where you can
Yeah.
kind of get right into the weeds with stuff, but you then have to chop, you know, 30-second clips of it up to try and put it on social media and actually get people to
Well, I can give you
visit the
some sound
links.
bites if you like, you know.
I'm sure we can find one or two in here from what we've discussed today. I wanted to ask as well. I mean, one of the things that's been like quite prevalent in you know political discourse in the last few years in the UK certainly has been this idea of like overdiagnosis of mental health conditions, like over identification with the idea of I guess, you know, even alienation, which we mentioned earlier. And I think, you know, autism and neurodivergence, they're talked about more often, but as you say, it's a spectrum. It encompasses people with such a wide range of abilities, challenges, ways of living. You know, what can we kind of do to, I guess, like productively discuss the full range of these lived experiences? Like, how do we represent the experience of, for instance, somebody who's completely nonverbal? Do you think that there's something to this theory that there's overdiagnosis happening, that too many people are trying to include themselves in that bracket of neurodivergence?
Well, I mean, to the question, is there an overdiagnosis? My answer would be an emphatic no,
Mm,
in the sense that what there is a developing awareness. You know, autistic people have always been there in probably the same quantities. It's just most of them weren't diagnosed unless they were white and middle class.
yeah,
You know, little professors, as Asperger used to call them. And so, you know, for example, if you think about women have always been chronically underdiagnosed with autism, as have black and brown people, you know, people of color, because it's always been associated with this sort of like, you know, eccentric white person, bloke.
yeah,
So there isn't an overdiagnosis, and I think that one of and cultures and societies and medical professions or what have you that say that are just reactionary, in the sense that they want tolerable autism, not intolerable or unpalatable autism. And I got this phrase unpalatable autism from a young woman of color, American woman, who talked about unpalatable autism, and what she means by unpalatable is not that black and brown people who are autistic are unpalatable, but they are considered to be not the sort of nice white middle class autism.
mm,
And that to me was a very rich idea, in the sense that and you know, so for example, I can talk about this stuff and sort of can sound moderately articulate and erudite or what have you about this sort of stuff, but yeah, if I were a non-verbal autistic person, I would have to have other means by which to speak. But the problem is that there isn't, we don't have networks of support and enablement for non-verbal autistic people. So what ends up happening is that I end up using my voice to talk about, as we do, talk about non-autistic people. I end up using this opportunity for being invited to this thing to talk about autistic people of color. Whereas what we should be doing, of course, is to sort of foreground those sorts of voices. So so there isn't an overdiagnosis, but there is a problem, and I write about this in my book, and I'm not I try and say this in a sort of much more neutral way. I think there is a problem of a dovetailing of individualized identity politicking and the convenient, or at least sort of rapacious urge to peculiarize and uniqueify oneself. So what you find in particular on TikTok and Instagram is that there are many videos of people sort of saying, you know, this is what an autistic person looks like. And, you know, we've all seen the videos, and it's like, you know, and those are really interesting for raising awareness. But there's also a complicity in these videos, whether and I'm not saying it's disingenuous. I think people don't realize they're doing it because we're all tied into these horrible networks. There's a sort of there's a complicity in using it as a kind of marketing tool to be cool.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mean that cynically, in the sense that I think, you know, I do the same. You know, we all do the same, and those videos are compelling when you and then it raises awareness. But what happens is that these individualized gestures of neurodivergence and individualized conceptions of neurodivergence, they end up diluting the very sort of real long form impact of what it is to be autistic in many ways. And again, this is not a personalized thing. I think it's the algorithms. So you often get, you know, very attractive people, you know, getting a lot of likes because they're autistic, and they are autistic. I'm not saying they're not, but what happens is those it ends up being the same kind of white middle class people that get a lot of attention to talk about autism, and that's a real problem. And I think unless we address unless we fight that enemy, as it were, which is algorithm individualization, the notion of progress, the notion of, you know, I don't know, like white people like being the ambassadors for these types of things, then it is a problem. And I think we're all complicit in that. You know, I'm complicit in that, and so there isn't like overdiagnosis, but there is a problem of, and it just feeds into reactionary people saying, oh, there's an overdiagnosis, look at all these people getting clicks and likes because they're having a meltdown and all that kind of stuff. Now, you know, that it just plays into that room. So I think that there's I don't really have a firm solution to all of this stuff, but I think that it's problematic. But I would emphatically say that there's a massive underrepresentation of women, trans people, black and brown people, people of color in the autistic discourse. But then it's always been thus.
Yeah,
you know,
and I guess that's true in wider society as well.
Exactly.
You know, why would it not be a feature of that anyway?
So autistic advocacy ends up replicating the debased conditions, which actually, you know, we should be competing against. And again, that's where I think long form books, these types of podcasts are much more important, and encouraging almost neurodivergent networks that work on kind of collective advocacy of all people, and that de-center, you know, white middle class blokes to and are, you know, push these voices to the fore, you know, and I think that's important.
That's interesting. And everything you've just said, how does that kind of connect to, I guess, like the collapsing of other forms of, you know, mental health conditions or, you know, genetic conditions into that umbrella of neurodivergence? Like, I'm bipolar, and I think my therapist at one point said to me something that would indicate that she considers bipolar to be under that umbrella of neurodivergence. Do you have a sort of resistance to that? Do you think it's useful to put conditions that aren't like ADHD and autism into the same umbrella as neurodivergence?
I mean, it depends upon. No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think that I think the thing is that what the question implies is that is quite right, is that we're all in a clamor for a kind of recognition of the very particular needs that we have. And so what happens is and the medical diagnoses, they're constantly changing. The next DSM may well, either put in bipolar or extricate bipolar or take out dyslexia or change ASD to Asperger's again or what have you. I don't know. The thing is, the terminology isn't really important. I think the problem is that the reason people get it's a problem of intersectionality in a sense, and I mean this in a positive way, in the sense that the problem with thinking intersectionally is that every single person has a trait which is not someone else's trait. So it's saying, well, what about me? What about that? What about that? And the problem is that produces an unnecessary competition among those in need.
Yes.
And that is very unhelpful. And I think that I understand why people would say, for example, if you think about it in terms of getting a disabled parking badge, right? I've got a disabled, what do they call it, like disabled parking badge, yeah.
It's called a blue badge up here.
Sorry, a blue badge. Yeah, I have one, and I feel I only use it in exceptional circumstances, but it does enable me to do things. Now, of course, people would look at me and go, "Well, you're not disabled. You can walk," and people do that, and that's fair. And I understand why people do that. Except I just point to the badge and move on, because I don't want to have a conversation about it because it's too stressful. But a lot of people would say, well, I shouldn't have access to that. But the only reason they'd say I shouldn't have access to that because in their head it's like a competition between disabled people.
Yes.
And that's not their fault that they think that way. It's society and culture that produces the conditions where it's like to say only special people should have access to these things. Whereas myself, you, and others, whether ADHD, bipolar, autistic, and then to wheelchair users and stuff like that, we all have a right to access services to enable us to live our lives. And I think it's unhealthy for disabled people. It's like with it's like the fight between sort of lesbians and trans and so what happens is that it becomes, we end up scrapping with other minorities in a really, really unhelpful way, or you could say scrapping with other minoritized people in really other ways, and in ways that only services the culture and society of individualism and competition. And so I think the term neurodivergence is useful. The term neurodiversity is useful in the sense that everyone is very, very different. The term spectrum can be unhelpful because it implies a sliding scale rather than, as we all know, I look very functional, but there are some ways in which I don't function at all. And so the spectrum. So, but I think that the fewer scraps we can have among disabled people and among people with mental health conditions as well, the more positive we can become. But I think the terms can become amorphous, and the problem is with one of the reasons terms become amorphous, because firstly, like, let's say the term neurodiversity is hijacked by right-wing presses to sort of say, everyone's neurodiverse now, and that's ignorant. But secondly, it's hijacked by a sort of a social media culture that kind of wants to that produces clickbait, neurodivergent clickbait, which perhaps isn't long form enough to enable people to think. And so, so for example, if you're consuming an Instagram video about someone saying this is what a meltdown looks like, or this is what, and then your next video is, I don't know, like some influencer talking about a t-shirt, then there's a false equivalence being made between a sort of the marketization of neurodivergence and the t-shirt.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And again, we're all complicit with that, but it leads to the watering down of neurodivergence as a label to be consumed rather than something that people very rarely deal with, on a daily basis, outside of TikTok or Instagram.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and I think it really shows the like the socialist principles that underpin the way you think about this. So
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated to read the whole book. I can't wait until we can read the whole thing. I've
Mm.
enjoyed this conversation as well. I've especially enjoyed Veronica's interventions. There
Yeah.
was one point in which she was sat on behind you, I think, and it looked like you had a cat's tail. So
Oh, well, there we
you know,
go. You know, I'm happy with that.
if you're listening to the audio version of this, go check the video as well. That this has been great. I wonder if I could finish with I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a trite or a pat question, but perhaps it'll be helpful for some of the listeners. If you could give advice to, let's say, the friends, family, the parents, or colleagues of a neurodivergent person, about how to make their life easier, how to support them, what would you say?
Oh, yeah, I'm pleased you ended that question, really, because it is important. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, is to have an open curiosity to uh, this person's expression of how they experience life, and to not resort when you talk to them and ask questions, not resort to um, phraseology and terminology and advice that you would necessarily apply to a neurotypical person. So in other words, have a curiosity. Also, allow the space for people to articulate, how they understand themselves. Have a curiosity about, for example, I recently shared with my parents a number of articles about autism, and be open to that. Be open to the ability to learn about not only the individual experience of the person that you love or your friend or what have you, but also about neurodivergence in general. Because I think that that sense of other people's kind of empathetic compassion and also curiosity, intellectual and emotional curiosity about how you might experience life quite differently from other people. Your interior life is not what it looks like as your exterior life, which is the same for everyone. But I think that, having that kind of openness, compassion, empathy, but also curiosity to listen, and also not resort to I think you used the phrase, what is it, torto phrases,
Mm,
or in your book, about like or what I would call collocations. Like, for example, if you say, well, we all experience that,
mm,
or yeah, I'm a little bit stressed as well. Those types of comments are so dangerous to an autistic person or to a neurodivergent person. If you say something like, yeah, I've experienced that, that's fine. But what I don't think people realize is that it sort of diminishes the experience, the unique experience of that individual, and it makes it um it appears empathetic, but it's the opposite, if you see what I
yeah,
mean.
yeah.
It's what, and I understand why people do it. It's like what they're trying to do is tell you that they struggle too. But
Hmm.
what it's important to realize, and I think this is the last thing it's sort of fair to say, is that if you are diagnosed ADHD, if you're diagnosed autistic, um, that means you're diagnosed autistic. That means you're diagnosed with ADHD. And what it means is that you don't. If people say to you something like, "Oh, we're all a little bit autistic," or what have you, that's emphatically not true.
Yeah,
And I don't think people realize how dangerous it is to say that, because you wouldn't say, for example, we're all a little bit diabetic.
mm,
And I know the analogy is not quite right, or we're all a little bit cancerous.
yeah.
And I think it's important to realize that. So yeah, openness,
Mm,
curiosity, and not resorting to the torto phrase or the collocations, the unthought out advice, which may seem compassionate and empathetic, but is actually, it kind of has the opposite impact.
yeah, yeah. No, that's a great answer. And as somebody with neurodivergent and autistic people kind of in my family and my friends group, I think that's a very, very useful piece of advice. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Okay.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I think your book's going to be a great contribution to this ongoing conversation about a very,
Well,
very important topic. So that's brilliant. Just to recap for those of you who've been listening along, we've been speaking today to Gareth Stuart Farmer, and his website is garethstuartfarmer.com, not .co.uk.com. You can also get a copy of the poetry book that he mentioned, from Broken Sleep Books. And that title, I will attempt not to butcher it here, is What's That? Instead of Ego 2, Acrostic Aftermaths and Other Poems, which is brilliant. Yeah, I think it's a great title. It's certainly one that you might struggle to remember, but you're not going to forget once you've heard it, if you see what I mean. So thank you very much indeed, Gareth, for joining me for this episode. This has been Strange Exiles with Revol Press. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. We'll have more of these chats with Revol authors past, present, and future in the coming months. Remember to follow Revol Press on Substack, where we regularly publish new essays exploring topics much like the ones we've explored today, from mental health to anti-capitalism to the history of left-wing thought. I've been your host, Bram E. Gieben. Thanks again to Gareth. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.